Thank you so much for inviting me to this event. It's a real honor to be here and talk to you in these terrible circumstances. So the title of this talk or conversation is on Palestinian and other resistance in times of catastrophe. It will in effect be divided into two parts. The first will focus on times of catastrophe, including climate catastrophe, and be reasonably well prepared. The second will focus on Palestinian resistance and be somewhat more impromptu in character. And I will only touch very briefly on other resistance towards the end before opening up for a general discussion. And I really believe that all the issues at hand here deserve a lot of urgent discussion, including, of course, critique of what I will say here. Some might be entirely obvious to all of you. Some you might consider extreme. In any case, I invite, of course, ruthless criticism. This talk might take a little bit more than 45 minutes. We'll see. There's a lot to say, even though I'm going to simplify a few things. It so happened a few weeks ago in a town on the eastern shores of the Mediterranean that people were killed in their sleep. Suddenly, a force from the sky destroyed their homes on top of them. Afterwards, reports described how random furniture and body parts poked up through pulverized buildings. In the words of a native of the town, I quote, "Corpses still litter the street, and drinkable water is in short supply. Whole families have been killed. This was a catastrophe unlike anything we have ever seen. The residents are searching for the bodies of their loved ones by digging with their hands and simple agricultural tools," end quote. There were Palestinian first responders rushing to the scene. According to one of them, quote, "The devastation is beyond all imagination. You walk through the city and see nothing but mud, silt, and demolished houses. The smell of corpses is everywhere. Entire families have been erased from the civil registry. You see death everywhere," end quote. I'm not here talking about Gaza. I'm talking about Derna, a town in eastern Libya, about 1,000 kilometers from Gaza. On the night of September 11, Storm Daniel hit Libya. During its 24 hours visitation, it dropped a load of water around 70 times larger than the average amount for the month of September. Derna was located at the mouth of a river running through a wadi towards the sea, normally within narrow banks, if indeed the river ran at all. This is desert country. But now suddenly the river rose, burst through two dams and crashed into Derna. The water, sediment, debris forming a bulldozer that ripped and roared through the city in the middle of the night of September 11. A force of such speed and violence as to drive structures and streets into the Mediterranean and turn the former center into a brownish, muddy bog. These scenes formed a striking prefiguration of those that would begin to play out in Gaza 26 days later. Indeed, the morphological similarity of these catastrophes is remarkable. Whole neighborhoods obliterated, families killed while sleeping, bodies buried under the rubble, body parts spread through the debris, the smell of corpses, death everywhere. There are major differences, of course. The forces that bombed Derna were of another nature than those bombing Gaza. The anonymous sower of death from the sky in Derna was not an air force, but the cumulative saturation of the atmosphere with carbon. Using the by now refined methodologies of weather attribution, researchers could quickly conclude that the floods of September 11 had been made 50 times more likely by the average warming so far, a mathematical formula for identifying the cause of the disaster. Only this warming could have brought about that event. During the preceding summer months, the waters of North Africa had been no less than 5.5 degrees warmer than the average from the previous 2 decades. And warm water holds heat energy that can get packed into a storm like fuel into a missile. Some 11,300 people were killed in one single night by Storm Daniel in Libya, the most intense event of mass killing by climate change so far in the decade, if not this century. Because rescue teams in Gaza have long been used to dealing with this kind of destruction, they moved swiftly into Derna to help out. And this was not the only direct connection between the two places. At least a dozen Palestinians who had fled from Gaza to Derna were killed in the floods. One Palestinian, Fayez Abu Amra, told Reuters, I quote, "Two catastrophes took place, the catastrophe of the displacement and the storm in Libya," end quote. The Arabic word for catastrophe here, of course, is Nakba. And the catastrophe of displacement, a reference to the Nakba of 1948. So according to this Palestinian, the first Nakba was the one of 1948, which drove his Abu Amra family and 800,000 other Palestinians out of their homeland and destroyed it. 300,000 of those refugees ended up in Gaza. And this most basic fact about Gaza is constantly forgotten. Why do so many people live in Gaza? What are they doing there? Well, 75% of the now about 2.3 million people in Gaza are refugees of the first or second or later generations, expelled from their homes in 1948 through countless massacres and other forms of systematic violence, and blocked ever since from returning. Expelled and excluded, that is, only because they were Palestinians and not Jews. Driven out at gunpoint for the single reason that they belonged to the wrong ethnic group. This then was the original Nakba. As for the Abu Amra family that ended up in Gaza, some members moved on to get away from the endless Israeli wars of aggression to the town of Derna, and then came a second Nakba. Fayez Abu Amra lost several relatives in the storm. He himself survived this storm, this Nakba, because he had chosen to stay behind in Gaza, in the refugee camp of Deir al-Balah, where mourning tents were erected for the victims. And then came, just a few weeks later, the genocide. God knows if Fayez Abu Amra is still alive, but what we do know is that much of Deir al-Balah and Gaza in general now look almost exactly like Derna. Before I delve into this most recent ongoing iteration of the never-ending Nakba and the meaning of the Palestinian resistance at this moment, I want to tease out some further parallels, homologies, points of articulation between the catastrophe of climate breakdown and the catastrophe of the occupation. And I want to begin by reading a few paragraphs from an article I wrote on Palestinian literature and cultures of resistance in the journal Salvage in 2017, partly later reworked into a chapter in the Cambridge Companion to Literature and the Anthropocene. I wrote, "How do you keep on fighting when everything is lost? Ask a Palestinian. A Palestinian is someone who is wading knee-deep in rubble. Palestinian politics is always already post-apocalyptic. It is about surviving after the end of the world and, in the best case, salvaging something out of all that has been lost. How do Palestinian writers describe the end of the world? In the ship, Jabra Ibrahim Jabra, who left Palestine for Iraq in 1948, looks back on a land overflowing with rivers and waterfalls, and laments the expulsion of his people into flaming deserts and screaming oil-producing cities. The same trajectory is retraced in his poem In the Deserts of Exile. I quote, "Our Palestine, green land of ours, March adorns its hills, April bursts open in its plains. They crushed the flowers on the hills around us, destroyed the houses over our heads, scattered our torn remains, then unfolded the desert before us. Our land is an emerald, but in the deserts of exile, spring after spring, only the dust hisses in our face." End quote. It's a peculiarity of the Palestinian experience that the moment of ending recurs endlessly. The end did not come to an end in 1948. Mahmoud Darwish called it the year without end. Not only are the refugees blocked from returning, but the original act of destroying the houses over the heads of their inhabitants is repeated again and again, from Al-Majdal in 1950 to Al-Arakib in 2016. So this was written in 2017. Fresh rubble is always poured out over the Palestinians. In A Balcony Over the Fakihani, Liana Badr describes one of these eternal recurrences in Beirut in 1982, but her words could fit any of the others. I quote, "I saw piles of concrete, stones, torn clothes scattered about, shattered glass, little pieces of cotton wool, fragments of metal, buildings destroyed or leaning crazily. White dust smothered the district, and through the gray of the smoke loomed the gutted shells of blocks and the debris of houses razed to the earth. Everything there was mixed up together. Cars were upside down, papers whirling in the sky, fire and smoke, the end of the world." End quote. So the scenes we are seeing in Gaza right now are not new in the Palestinian experience. To the contrary, they are the essence of it. Because this is the political DNA of the Zionist project. It destroys the homes of the Palestinians and drives them out of their lands so they can be turned into a state reserved for Jews. This is what Zionism has always been about. What we're seeing right now is only the genocidal culmination so far of a process that has been going on for a very long time indeed. How long exactly? Well, 1948 is obviously a key date, and so is 1923, 100 years ago, when Palestine became a British mandate, and so is 1917, when Britain promised to hand over the land of Palestine to the Zionists in the Balfour Declaration. But it began long before that date too. In fact, coincidentally, it began in the very same moment as large-scale fossil fuel combustion was first rolled out of the planet. That practice was, of course, born in the UK. It reached other parts of the world through the vehicle of the steamboat, a ship powered by coal, and more particularly through the armed steamboat, a ship with cannons and other weapons on it powered by coal. The first time such a boat was deployed on the battlefield and played a decisive role was in 1840 on the coasts of Palestine. In that year, Britain waged war against the Egyptian Pasha Muhammad Ali, who controlled most of the Levant. The decisive battle stood at the Palestinian port town of Akka. The Egyptians had repaired the walls of the old Crusader capital in the town, armed its ramparts with heavy guns and garrisoned it with thousands of soldiers. A major depot, it also held an enormous amount of ammunition. On 1st November 1840, a squadron of 4 British steamboats reached Akka, and when the Arabs rejected the summons to surrender, they began bombarding the town. Massive shelling went on for 2 days. Then in the afternoon of the 3rd of November 1840, a deafening detonation ripped through Akka. I quote from one of the many renderings of the event. The dreadful crash was heard far above the tumult of the assault and was immediately succeeded by a most awful pause. The firing on both sides was suddenly suspended, and for a few minutes, nothing broke the fearful silence but the echoes of the mountains repeating the sound like the rumbling of distant thunder and the occasional fall of some tottering building. End quote. One of the steamboats had hit Akka's great powder magazine with a shell and caused this enormous explosion. And correspondence between the British commanders shows that they were aware of its position and planned to target this magazine. The impact concluded the battle. Said a report to London, 2 entire regiments were annihilated and every living creature within the area of 60,000 square yards ceased to exist, the loss of life being variously computed from 1,200 to 2,000 persons, end quote. When British soldiers entered Akka on the 4th of November, they were greeted by utter devastation. I quote from another contemporary description. Corpses of men, women and children, blackened by the explosion of the magazine and mutilated in the most horrid manner by the cannon shot, lay everywhere about, half buried among the ruins of the homes and fortifications. Women were searching for the bodies of their husbands, children for their fathers. So this is November 1840. British officers and shipmen described hundreds of dead and dying bodies uncollected in the ruins, hands, arms, toes sticking out of the rubble, an entire town pulverized. This was the first war whose outcome was determined by steamboats, so fossil-fueled warships, wholly superior to the sailing ships of old in their flexibility and precision. It was the war that broke Muhammad Ali's project of turning Egypt into a modern industrial state and inaugurated a century of British colonial control over that country and the Middle East, more generally. It was the war that marked the beginning of the globalization of large-scale fossil fuel combustion, and it was also the war that gave birth to the idea of sending Jews to colonize Palestine on behalf of the West. In the wake of the destruction of Akka and the defeat of Muhammad Ali, the British Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston, the chief designer of the mid-19th century British Empire, wrote a series of letters to his ambassadors and allies in the regions and instructed them to seize this opportunity to, quote, do what you can about these Jews, end quote. The Jews, Palmerston suggested, should be given, quote, every encouragement and facility for returning and buying lands in Palestine, and if they were allowed to make use of our consuls and ambassador as the channel of complaint, that is to say, to place themselves virtually under our protection, they would come back in considerable numbers and bring with them them much wealth, end quote. This in a letter from 25 of November 1840. And again in a letter written by Lord Palmerston a few days later, there should be encouragement, quote, to the Jews to go and settle in Palestine. The capital and the industry of the Jews would much increase revenue and add greatly to the strength of the empire, end quote. This was the idea that would later crystallize as the program for Zionist colonization of Palestine sponsored by the West. Today, nearly 2 centuries later, it is not Lord Palmerston but Joe Biden that is overseeing the alliance. And Biden has been very frank about its value throughout his career. In 1986, he told Congress, I quote, "Israel is the best $3 billion investment we make. Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect our interests in the region," end quote. And that really says it all. Were there not an Israel, the United States would have to invent an Israel to protect its interests. Biden again in 2007, quote, "Israel is the single greatest strength America has in the Middle East. Imagine our circumstance in the world were there no Israel," end quote. And Biden again in 2010, quote, "There's simply no space between the United States and Israel." And he repeated, "There's no space between the United States and Israel," end quote. And I could go on. Today, it is not the UK and Lord Palmerston sending steamboats to pulverize Palestinian towns. It is the US and Joe Biden sending all conceivable kinds of bombs to the IDF for the pulverization of Palestinian towns at a scale never seen before, but along a trajectory that has been in place for nearly 2 centuries. We are talking about processes so deeply entrenched, so stable over such a long durée as to take on the aspect of structure. And coincidentally, or not so coincidentally, the colonization of Palestine then derives from the moment in time when the West started attacking other parts of the world with coal-powered warships and forcibly integrate them into the fossil economy. The rubble and corpses in Akka set the stage for both. The fate of Palestine has been imbricated with fossil fuels ever since. The British mandate was very much about oil, and so was, of course, the rise of the US to the position of the primary sponsor and supplier of the State of Israel in the 1970s. More recently, this imbrication has taken on a new form in the surge of Israeli investment in fossil fuels. In recent years, Israel has massively expanded its production of oil and gas off the coast of historical Palestine, in the fields and the waters outside places like Gaza and Akka. Much of this production is geared to export to the EU, particularly since the war in Ukraine started as replacement for the Russian gas. But the relation goes both ways. A major new player in the North Sea is Ithaca Energy, a company based in Tel Aviv, which now owns 2 of the most destructive carbon bombs planted in the British sector of the North Sea, the Cambo and the Rosebank fields. Conversely, in late October, on the day after the ground invasion in Gaza began, the State of Israel awarded 12 licenses for the exploration of new gas fields. One of the companies picking them up was BP, the same company that first discovered oil in the Middle East. So now, in 2023, as Israel is waging a genocidal campaign in Gaza, this entity is arguably more deeply integrated in the fossil empire than ever before, a partner in the relentless expansion of fossil fuel production. And such expansion has been interwoven with the colonization of Palestine. We can now conclude from the very beginning and all the way through. But that interweaving is only one of the fractal iterations of the dialectics of these catastrophes. I will be quicker henceforth. On the most general level, the occupation of Palestine and the breakdown of the climate system are 2 processes of destruction. In the former, it is one land and one people being destroyed. In the latter, it is the biosphere as a whole, and in the last instance, every people living inside it. This is the deeper meaning of the morphological similarity between the recent scenes in Darna and Gaza. The driver of climate breakdown is the investment in fossil fuel infrastructure. It is entirely evident and fully demonstrated that such investment must end, and indeed should have ended long ago, and yet it goes on. Year after year, more pipelines, more rigs, more platforms and terminals and mines are planned and built, and the more of them there are, the more difficult it becomes to cut emissions. The more fixed capital is sunk into the ground, the greater the imperative to maintain it and defend it against any decommissioning, any transition away from fossil fuels. The driver of the occupation of Palestine is the investment in colonies. It is entirely evident and fully demonstrated that such investment must end, and indeed should have ended long ago. And yet it goes on, year after year. More settlements, ever more settlements are planned and built on the West Bank and in Jerusalem. And the more Palestinian land is confiscated, the more housing units are erected and reserved for Jews only, the more difficult it becomes to envision a withdrawal to the Green Line, the more immovable the occupation, the greater the interest in keeping it going and defending it against any scheme for a viable Palestinian state. This analogy at the level of the material base, creating ever more facts on the ground that prolong and intensify business as usual, is reflected at the level of the superstructure. The world community keeps talking about 1.5 or 2 degrees and about a two-state solution, while actually existing processes of investment work ceaselessly to make both goals physically impossible. Talk of 2 degrees or 2 states here takes on the character of ideological cover. It generates a semblance, an appearance, the fundamentally false impression that world leaders, such as Joe Biden, are interested in sustainable outcomes when what they are doing in actual reality is to speed up the catastrophe on every front. The parallelism is, I think, quite astonishing when one juxtaposes the COP summits to the summits of what was once known as the peace process. Both commenced at the same moment in time in the early 1990s, and both had the function of sustaining the illusion that the so-called international community was working to mitigate climate change and giving Palestinians their own state, respectively. Both operated with the same vacuous diplomatic rituals and incantations. Both covered up for the continued expansion of fossil fuels and colonial domination. But today, of course, only one of them remains. We currently have to suffer through the 28th edition of the COP circus, more vacated of meaning and substance than any before it, while there are no longer any handshakes on the lawn outside the White House. The peace process ended in 2005, when the state of Israel reconfigured its occupation of Gaza into the operation of a concentration camp. All that then remained was the never-ending Nakba. And in this respect, as in so many others, the catastrophe of Palestine appears to prefigure that of climate. In both cases, knowledge of the deepening catastrophe has never been lacking. This is a law that is repeated on a daily basis. Let me just read one item from the Al Jazeera live blog from yesterday. I quote, UN delivers another warning of apocalyptic Gaza conditions. That's the headline. UN delivers another warning of apocalyptic conditions. And further. Palestinians in Gaza are facing utter, deepening horror as disease spreads, food is scarce, and humanitarian aid is all but cut off, the UN's human rights chief has warned. Volker Turk said Wednesday that some 1.9 million displaced Palestinians are being forced into smaller and smaller pockets of southern Gaza. The conditions are overcrowded and unsanitary, he said. My humanitarian colleagues have described the situation as apocalyptic, Turk added, saying the catastrophe was entirely foreseeable and preventable, end quote. The catastrophe was entirely foreseeable and preventable. But the way the dominant classes and their governments decided to deal with it was through all manner of denial. Or, in the words of Antonio Guterres himself, also from yesterday, quote, the situation is fast deteriorating into a catastrophe with potentially irreversible consequences. An even worse situation could unfold, including epidemic diseases and increased pressure for mass displacement, end quote. Now, the UN chief has often used almost identical words, word for describing the climate catastrophe underway, because the situations here are one and the same in this crucial respect. We know everything we need to know about the catastrophe that is happening, and yet the powers that be do nothing but fan the flames. I will only mention one more common denominator, and this is perhaps the most important. In the climate catastrophe, the lives of non-white multitudes in the global south do not count. They are expendable. They have no value. We saw this playing out in the disaster that struck Darna. The more than 11,000 people killed over one single night left only the tiniest trace in the media of the West and none whatsoever in its politics. Just imagine if these had been 11,000 white Americans or Brits or Swedes killed over one night. Imagine if it had been 11,000 of us of the people that really count. Imagine the uproar. But here was just the wretched of the earth dying as they always do. In the Mediterranean and other graveyards of the world, they're dying being in the natural order of things. No notice paid to the circumstance that the excess of carbon in the atmosphere that killed those people was put there by the rich of the global north. Instead, if there was any talk of blame and culpability in Western media, the Libyans themselves were held responsible for the disaster. Had they not built such weak dams on that river, Darna would have withstood the pressure. In the land of Palestine, the lives of Palestinians do not count. They are completely expendable. They have no value, none at all. This is the lesson we have learned once again in the past 2 months. It's something we have known for a very long time, but never has it been demonstrated with such extreme clarity and cruelty as this time. Just imagine if it had been 20,000 Americans or Swedes or most obviously Israeli Jews that had been killed in this manner. No, I think this is not something that can be imagined. It defies the political imagination. It goes beyond anything that could happen inside the world as we know it. And then the mass death of the Palestinians is, of course, also their own fault. It happens because their own poorly built rockets crash into hospitals, because they use their civilians as human shields, because they place their weapons in or next to or under schools and residential buildings, because of what they did on the 7th of October, 2 months ago to the day. That was the first part, and now comes the second, less well prepared. So let us turn to the issue of the resistance. I will leave the climate dimension to the side and only return to it briefly towards the end. And I will be a little more personal from now on and try to restrain my emotions. You know, Palestine is a very emotionally intense issue, and I have, for the past 2 months, obsessively followed the news all the time. And as I'm sure many of you have been unable to think about anything else from the moment I wake up until the morning, until the moment I go to sleep. This is the first time during these 2 months that I get a chance to talk at some length about it in public. So all of these emotions that I have sort of accumulated over these 2 months now are at the risk of discharge. We'll see how this goes. You know, I've been quite active in Palestinian solidarity movements of various kinds, but not in this most recent period, because most of my work has been on climate. So for that reason, there's been this accumulation of emotion with no outlet of the 2 months. Now you're going to be the outlet here, and I apologize for any suffering I inflict on you here. I think personally that Palestinians have a right to resist the occupation. And Palestinians have tried every conceivable form of resistance. They've tried peaceful marches, including the Great March of Return in Gaza in 2018, which only resulted in Israeli snipers killing 223 unarmed demonstrators. They've tried strikes and boycotts. They've tried writing poetry and posting on social media. They've tried throwing stones. They've tried diplomacy, including recognizing the state of Israel and giving it all it demands without getting anything back. They've tried going to courts. They've tried the international community endlessly. And yes, they've tried various forms of armed resistance. And the armed resistance that is happening right now in Gaza is, in my view, heroic. I don't know if you've seen these videos that come out of Palestinian fighters literally hiding in the rubble and targeting Israeli tanks and armored personnel carriers with their simple grenades. There's that now sort of viral red triangle pointing to the targets before the explosions go off. Some of you have seen these videos. Now, I will be honest and personal. I consume these videos as a drug every evening. I inject them into my veins. I share them with my closest comrades, one in particular, a key organizer in both the climate and the Palestine solidarity movement in London. He and I share those videos and shoot them up our arms because it's the only way we can stay reasonably sane in this time of catastrophe. It gives us the hope that maybe, at least there's a tiny little hope that maybe the perpetrators of catastrophe can be defeated. I personally rejoice every time I see an Israeli tank on fire, and I honestly do not see how one could not do so. These are the tanks of an invading force bent on destroying the people of Gaza. How could it not be a good thing that they go up in flames? The tactic of the resistance in Gaza right now is to try to inflict sufficient military damage on the invading force through urban guerrilla warfare to force it to realize that Gaza is a quagmire, it is a swamp for invaders, and to compel them to withdraw. We don't know if this is going to work, might not. But I don't see what else the Palestinians could or should do in this moment. Now, if we go back to what happened on the 7th of October when Tufan al-Aqsa was launched, the actor behind that operation was the Palestinian resistance. It was not only Hamas. We know now that the brigades in Gaza had a joint operations room. So it was the Qassam brigades, the main military force, of course, the armed wing of Hamas. It was Saraya al-Quds, the Jihad Islami military wing. It was the Abu Ali Mustafa brigades, the military wing of the PFLP, the fraction that I personally have always sympathized with politically. It was the Shahid Omar al-Qasim brigades, the armed wing of the DFLP. It was the Mujahideen brigades. It was the Nasser Salahuddin brigades, and a few others. So we should refer to what happened on the 7th of October and ever since as being executed by the Palestinian resistance. Not Hamas only. Hamas mainly, but not Hamas only. And I still think that what happened on the 7th of October with Tufan al-Aqsa was fundamentally an act of liberation. Now, don't worry, I'll get back to the issue of civilian deaths shortly. But fundamentally, I think this was an act of liberation. And I want to quote here a Palestinian observer who I find to be quite excellent, Mariam Barghouti. She wrote this on the 14th of October, so 1 week after Tufan al-Aqsa had begun. I quote her. And then came the images and footage of the broken wall. In one video showing a bulldozer bringing down the wall, a Palestinian man can be heard chanting in exhilaration. Yes, go, Allahu Akbar, hit it guys, rest in peace, wall. It was unbelievable. It felt surreal. We wondered how it was possible that the people of Gaza had broken out of their prison. Few in the world would understand our feelings in that moment. Perhaps political prisoners might. In this context, seeing those images and videos of the prison wall torn down in Gaza is liberating. Their symbolic power cannot be overstated. We felt the same exhilaration back in 2021 when we heard the news that 6 Palestinian political prisoners had broken out of Israeli prison. They had dug a tunnel out of jail using spoons, pieces of metal, and loads of patience. Not only did Palestinians manage to break free from their prison in Gaza, albeit for a short while, but also for the first time they dealt a blow that will have a far-reaching impact. The Palestinians have struck Israel where it has struck Palestinians for more than 75 years, lives and land. The Israeli arrogance and sense of security that it can oppress, kill, and steal land with impunity have been shattered. We've been held hostage by Israel for decades. We've been prisoners in our land for generations. But this October, the wimpy kid finally got his punch, and the bully is now shaken. As our oppressors are out killing indiscriminately in a blind rage, an uncomfortable feeling is creeping in among them that the prison they are holding us in is starting to crumble, end quote. So the emancipatory dimensions of Tufan al-Aqsa was first of all breaking out of the prison that has been Gaza, under siege, completely enclosed for so long. It was also the act of returning home. The main scenes of armed confrontation in what is euphemistically referred to as the Gaza envelope on that day were the very places from which people now residing in Gaza were expelled in 1948. So Sderot is actually Najd. Ashkelon is actually Al-Majdal, which I happened to mention in passing earlier. Ashdod is actually Isdud. And these places were, according to the UN partition plan of 1947, supposed to fall to the Palestinian half of Palestine. Instead, what happened, of course, during the war of 1948 was that the Zionist forces conquered these places violently and expelled their population and drove them into Gaza. Now, what happened on the 7th of October was that for the first time, these people returned to their lands by means of their own agency and autonomy. And that was fundamentally an act of liberation. Thirdly, the supposedly invincible army of the State of Israel suffered its most disastrous defeat ever during that day. Not at the hands of the armed forces of any nation states, but at the hands of the Palestinian resistance itself. So, Tufan al-Aqsa was an act of liberation, the greatest act of liberation in this region, if not the world, since the Egyptian Revolution. Now we come to the question of civilian deaths. So I personally think that the killing of occupation soldiers on that day was entirely legitimate. Because Palestinians, as any other occupied people, has the right to resist their occupation. This includes killing the soldiers occupying the land. The question of civilian deaths is another matter. Every civilian death is a tragedy. And there was a compounded tragedy when peace activists like Vivian Silver and Haim Katzman were killed. And you know that among the victims on that day were quite a few Israelis who had been engaged in solidarity work with the Palestinians, including in Gaza itself. So like I said, I personally rejoice every time the resistance takes down an occupation soldier, but obviously one cannot feel the same way when a civilian is killed. The overwhelming of the military fortifications, including the Eretz crossing, for those of you who happen to be there, you know, only the idea that Palestinian fighters could take over that place, which is, you know, something out of Mordor. It's like it's the worst military fortification by far that I have ever seen. You know, it was completely unimaginable, and you know. Yeah. But the killing of civilians does fall into another category completely. It's tragic, it's deplorable, it's lamentable, it inspires feelings of unease, even disgust, and it is awfully complicated. How can we try to understand the death of civilians on the 7th of October? So the toll, as I understand it, stands roughly around 350 soldiers killed on that day, or 300 perhaps, and somewhere between 600 and 800 civilians, something like that. Well, first of all, I think it should be noted that Israel does not value the lives of its civilians higher than the lives of its soldiers. If anything, the contrary. You know, there's sometimes this idea that the death of a civilian is, from the Israeli perspective, perceived as more terrible than the death of an Israeli soldier. And the implicit argument would be that if only the Palestinian resistance had killed soldiers on that day, the response wouldn't have been as aggressive. But I don't think this chimes with what we know about how the State of Israel behaves. So the war in 2006 with Lebanon, when much of Lebanon was destroyed, was triggered by the resistance in Lebanon capturing 3 Israeli soldiers only. That's when IDF, you know, marched into Lebanon and completely destroyed the country. When in the same year the Palestinian resistance in Gaza captured 1 Israeli soldier, the IDF went into Gaza and killed about 450 Palestinians and destroyed a lot of it. And the whole arithmetic of the prison exchange negotiations is based on this insight that when the resistance releases civilian hostages, the Israeli occupation in response releases the prisoners that it puts the lowest value on. The high value captives are the soldiers, for which the price will be enormously high, and everyone knows this. So I don't believe that if the death toll had stopped at 300 Israeli soldiers, Israel would have reacted in any kind of more lenient fashion, perhaps to the contrary. It was an incredible slight to Israeli self-perception that the Israeli army was defeated on that day. And the main aim of Tufan al-Aqsa was obviously to strike precisely this unprecedented blow against the Israeli military and to force the release of the thousands of Palestinian prisoners languishing in the dungeons. So the idea was to capture these hostages and negotiate a prisoner release, to get info and weapons from the armed bases, and to make it hard to recapture the colonies, the kibbutzes and other colonies in the Gaza envelope, and to slow down and in the best case prevent, although no one really believed in that, I imagine, the IDF from retaking the envelope by means of negotiating with the hostages taken. Now, I think it's pretty clear that the success of Tufan al-Aqsa initially completely exceeded the expectations of the resistance. They didn't expect that it would be so easy to overwhelm the Israeli defenses and storm into southern Palestine. And what then ensued was, to a significant extent, a kind of chaos, where a lot of Palestinian groups operating in semi-autonomy drove into the envelope around Gaza and did various different kinds of things. And I think that at this moment we had the mass killing of civilians, and I think there were three sources of these mass killings. One was planned, calculated, intentional killing of civilians at the hands of the Palestinian resistance. The second source was unplanned, spontaneous, eruptive killing of civilians at the hands of the Palestinian resistance. And the third source was the killing of Palestinian fighters and Israeli civilians by the IDF. And we do not know exactly the proportions between these three sources of mass killing, although I think we can say that we know that all the three existed. It does seem, although we haven't seen conclusive proof that Hamas actually ordered its fighters to kill civilians. They say that they didn't, but I wouldn't rule it out. I think there's a logic behind that that has often been, internalized and expressed by the Palestinian resistance. The logic being that Israeli civilians cannot imagine, or cannot be allowed to imagine, that they can live a life in security as long as we live in total insecurity. That is the logic behind intentionally attacking Israeli civilians, to puncture the structure of a luxury occupation where you can dance or you can live in actual luxury next to a concentration camp. And this logic has now been understood by quite a few world leaders, including people like Emmanuel Macron and others, who say, and who have been saying in the past months, that Israel will never have security as long as Palestinians do not have security. This is what we learned on 7th of October. As for the spontaneous killing that happened in the chaos, and this goes, I think, largely for what happened at the Supernova Festival. We know now that the Palestinian resistance fighters were not aware of this event. This is according to Israeli reports. But when they flew in with these paragliders, suddenly they saw these hundreds of thousands of people dancing at a stone's throw from the concentration camp in which they are locked up. And what ensued was clearly mass killing of people dancing, which is, again, highly deplorable, but not incomprehensible. I think that if you live in a concentration camp and you're absolutely unable to move anywhere out of it, then suddenly you have this paraglider and you manage for the first time fly out of the concentration camp and you land among people who are dancing. And they've come from all parts of the world. And you have a gun. And you would probably, in that moment, express the anger that you have inside you with some unplanned destructive violence against civilians. And when it comes to the IDF attacks, the chaos here was such that also the IDF responded impulsively. The IDF was taken completely by surprise, and we now know that there were IDF helicopters that bombed the Supernova dancers and the Palestinian resistance indiscriminately from the sky. And we now know from quite a lot of evidence coming out from the kibbutzes that when the Palestinian resistance fighters were in the houses with the hostages, the IDF tanks shelled everything and was responsible for a lot of the supposed burning of bodies that happened. And this being, a very chaotic situation where some of the killing actually happened and was done by the IDF itself. Now, why did these civilians kill? Why was there a civilian population here that was killed? Well, to fundamentally understand this, we need to understand the logic of settler colonialism, the settler colonial project that is the Israeli occupation. You didn't have American civilians dying in Vietnam at the hands of the FNL or caught in the crossfire, because the American military presence in Vietnam was not a settler colonial project. It was not about displacing the Vietnamese civilian population and filling the land with another civilian population. But that is the logic of the settler colonial project that is the State of Israel. So the so-called envelope around Gaza was cleared, ethnically cleansed of Palestinians in 1948 and filled with another civilian population, a militarized one. I mean, these colonies have, of course, always been fortified and, quasi-military, if not outright military, front positions against the Palestinians in Gaza. So their civilian character is a little bit blurred. But there is a civilian population there that has been put in place on the land from which the Palestinian presence has been eliminated. And this is fundamentally the reason for the civilian casualties on that day. This isn't exactly the first time that liberation struggles against settler colonies have caused civilian deaths. There was a very famous such struggle in the form of the anti-apartheid struggle that did exactly the same thing. This is the autobiography of Nelson Mandela, The Long Walk to Freedom. And he writes on page 617 about the first bombs placed by Umkhonto we Sizwe, the armed wing of the ANC, so essentially their Qassam brigades. He writes, I quote, MK's first car bomb attack took place in May 1983 and was aimed at an Air Force and military intelligence office in the heart of Pretoria. This was an effort to retaliate for the unprovoked attacks the military had launched on the ANC in Maseru and elsewhere, a massacre that had just taken place. And it was a clear escalation of the armed struggle. 19 people were killed and more than 200 injured. The killing of civilians was a tragic accident, and I felt a profound horror at the death toll. But disturbed as I was by these casualties, I knew that such accidents were the inevitable consequence of the decision to embark on a military struggle. Human fallibility is always a part of war, and the price of it is always high. It was precisely because we knew that such incidents would occur that our decision to take up arms had been so grave and reluctant. But as Oliver, one of his close comrades, said at the time of the bombing, the armed struggle was imposed upon us by the violence of the apartheid regime, end quote. And of course, the ANC continued after this event with its armed attacks. So the loss of civilian life was not a reason for the ANC to call off its armed struggle. And Nelson Mandela, who is now revered as this hero, he was labeled a terrorist by the US until 2008, precisely for this kind of armed struggle that he engaged in. He visited Gaza in 1999. He told the people there, choose peace rather than confrontation, except in cases when we cannot get, where we cannot proceed, or we cannot move forward. Then if the only alternative is violence, we will use violence. This was Nelson Mandela visiting Gaza in 1999. I also visited Gaza in 1999. This was my first visit to Gaza in 1999. And I assure you, it was a paradise in Gaza in 1999 compared to what it's been in recent years. If Nelson Mandela had visited Gaza at any point in the 2010s, I'm sure he would have repeated this much more insistently than what he did. And there is a major difference between the settler colonial regime in South Africa and the one in Palestine. And the difference is that the goal of the settler colonial regime, the apartheid regime in South Africa, was never to eliminate the presence of the blacks. It was to exploit them to the maximum. The goal of the settler colonial regime in Palestine has always been to eliminate the Palestinian presence, and in that sense it's much more resembling the settler colonial projects in North America, which was also about eliminating the indigenous populations and their presence. The big difference here being, of course, that the Palestinians haven't been eliminated because they have resisted and are still in their land. And that's why this conflict is still ongoing. Now, on the issue of civilian casualties, we find them again in the struggle of the FLN against the settler colony in Algeria, in the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya, in the Sepoy uprising, the largest anti-colonial revolt in the mid-19th century, in the Nocturnal rebellion, in the Haitian revolution. You know, there was this yarn about Hamas fighters beheading babies on the first day of the Final Aqsa. We now know that they didn't do that. There's no evidence whatsoever. And the story has been retracted. But the Haitian revolution actually did this. The slaves who rose up on Saint-Domingue actually marched into the houses of their white masters and beheaded babies and took the heads of the babies on pikes and paraded through the colony. How do we view the Haitian revolution today? I mean, the Haitian revolution contained a lot of massacres of white people. How do we view this today? Well, we view the Haitian revolution as the largest emancipatory project and event in the 18th century, because unlike the French Revolution, it insisted on the equality of all people, regardless of color. And the massacres that happened in the Haitian Revolution are today perceived as the ugly sides of a beautiful freedom struggle. Likewise with the massacres in the Sepoy uprising, the Mau Mau rebellion, the FLN freedom struggle, and I think that a few decades from now, when we look back at what happened on the 7th of October, likewise, we will see the mass killing of civilians as the ugly, deplorable, lamentable, tragic dimensions of a fundamentally beautiful liberation struggle. Yeah. There's more to say this, but I've sort of run over my time. I wanted to say a few words on the question. Okay. On the even more unsavory aspects of the violence that we saw from Palestinian fighters on the 7th of October, we need to remember that in many cases of subaltern violence in history, there has been this moment of almost a festival, a carnival, an orgy of ecstatic retribution against the oppressors. That can take, again, extremely disagreeable forms, but none of this violence can be understood outside of the context of decades or even centuries of daily systematic violence from the oppressors. It's precisely that kind of violence that gives rise to this subaltern, eruptive, retributive violence. And here, of course, we have to touch upon the issue of anti-Semitism, because what we've heard since the first moments of the Tufan al-Aqsa is that people around Gaza, civilians, were killed because they were Jews. So we've heard that this was the worst killing of Jews since the Holocaust. And, you know, the State of Israel and its defenders have taken every opportunity to hammer home the message that this is all about hatred for the Jews, and that the goal of Hamas is to annihilate the Jewish people as a whole. And you hear this repeated endlessly. Now, this isn't exactly the first time that we hear that Palestinian resistance is animated by anti-Semitism. I mean, this has always been alleged claim that the reason that Palestinians resist is that they hate Jews and other Arabs as well. You know, Arafat was likened to Hitler in his bunker in Beirut in 1982, just as Netanyahu today is likening Yahya Sinwar to Arafat to Hitler in his bunker. What we're asked to believe here is that if the colonizers who had come to Palestine had been Baluchis, or Basques, or Roma, or Rohingya, or some other people, the Palestinians would just have said yes. Come, take our land, drive us from our homes, cut down our olive trees, put us into jail, kill us, our children, torture us, besiege us, displace us again and again and again. Our only problem is with Jews. Does anyone seriously believe this to be the case? That is the identity, the ethnic or religious identity of the colonizers that is causing the resistance. Of course it's not. I don't think that the Palestinians would have behaved in any way differently had the Zionist enterprise been about some other ethnic group than Jews, including Hamas. Now, when it comes to Hamas, the original charter of Hamas from 1988 did contain awful anti-Semitic discourse about Jews being responsible for the Russian Revolution, the French Revolution, references to the protocols of the Elders of Zion, and stuff like that. Now, people who know anything about Hamas know that the charter soon after ceased to play a real role as a political document, but it was retained, unfortunately, and not replaced with a new charter until 2017, this being part of Hamas' efforts to negotiate and develop a political project in relation to the state of Israel and the so-called international community. In this charter, we read, point 16, Hamas affirms that its conflict is with the Zionist project, not with the Jews because of their religion. Hamas does not wage a struggle against the Jews because they are Jewish, but wages a struggle against the Zionists who occupy Palestine. Yet it is the Zionists who constantly identify Judaism and the Jews with their own colonial project and illegal entity. So this is what they say. Now, do we have any reason to trust Hamas on this point? Might it be that they just say this while, in fact, their real aim is to kill Jews in their capacity as Jews, and that their real enmity is towards the Jewish population in its Jewishness? Well, there's a very simple test to find out. If Hamas wanted to kill Jews in their capacity of Jews, Hamas would have done so around the world. We know that there are Jews living virtually all over the world. New York, only the religiously observant Jewish population in New York is twice as large as the entire Jewish population of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem combined. Now, that's only the religiously observant Jewish population in New York. Hamas has sympathizers all over the world. Hamas clearly has logistical capacity to do this kind of things. But Hamas hasn't in one single case attacked a Jewish target outside of historical Palestine, nor has Islamic Jihad. And this is an interesting anomaly in the history of the Palestinian resistance movement, because in the 1970s and 80s, the secular Palestinian resistance movement engaged in what was known as external operations. So Fatah, PFLP, the PFLP-GC, attacked Israeli and Jewish targets around the world in external operations. Hamas and Jihad are the two factions that have said, we are never going to do this. And they never have until now. Now, God knows what's going to happen after this genocide, but up to this point, they have only attacked targets in historical Palestine. And as for anti-Semitism in Palestinian culture, I will share my personal view of this. My view is that given the depth of anti-Semitism as an ideological current in Western society in particular, And given the extent of the atrocities committed by a self-identified Jewish state against the Palestinian people, given these two factors in combination, what is actually remarkable is the paucity of anti-Semitism in Palestinian culture. If you consider, for instance, Palestinian literature, if you read, I challenge you, point me to one single case of anti-Semitic stereotypes about Jews in the books of Ghassan Kanafani or Jabra Ibrahim Jabra or Elias Khouri or Sahar Khalifa or Isabella Hamad or Mahmoud Darwish or any of the Palestinian writers. I mean, you will find infinitely more anti-Semitic stereotypes about Jews being greedy, Jews being powerful, Jews sleeping with one eye open, Jews being this way, Jews being that way, in Swedish working class literature. Anti-Semitism has a much stronger presence, that type of anti-Semitism, in Swedish political culture and literature than in Palestinian equivalents. Point me to any instances in the speeches given by Abu Ubaidah, or Mohammed Deif, or Khalid Ismail Haniyeh, or Khalid Mish'al, where that kind of anti-Semitic rhetoric exists. You will find it in speeches by Mahmoud Abbas. He's been saying vile things about the Holocaust recently. He said that the Jews were not killed because they were Jews, they were killed because they were moneylenders and had really quite terrible things, he said. And this is a phenomenon in Arab political culture, that collaboration with the state of Israel is sort of compensated for by pseudo-radical anti-Jewish rhetoric. But you don't hear that from the Qassam brigades or from Sarai al-Quds. Now, the absurdity of focusing on the anti-Semitism that Jews have historically been subjected to, or are, of course, subjected to in various forms around the world right now, is similar to, I think this is a very good analogy made by Owen Jones, those people who, during the massacre in Srebrenica, the most recent genocide that we had in Europe, chose to focus on the persecution that Serbs have historically been subjected to and were subjected to at that moment as well, and constantly shifting the focus to the genocide perpetrated against the Serbs during the Second World War, when an actual genocide was unfolding against Muslims in Srebrenica. And this is what we're seeing right now. All of this talk, endless focus in Swedish media, Aftonbladet Kultur, GP, all of it on anti-Semitism as the problem. Verbal anti-Semitism, when an actual genocide is taking place in Gaza. And there's only one explanation for this, and it is that Palestinian lives do not count and do not have value, because if they had in the eyes of these people, that would be the problem to discuss. We know that the genocide that's taking place right now has been advertised, and this is, of course, the key criterion of a genocide, that it is intentional. There is no shortage, I'm sure you know this, of statements from the leaders of the state of Israel about the people in Gaza being human animals, children of darkness, monsters, or the reference to Amalek, the Palestinians being the Amalekites who were subjected to genocide in the Old Testament, or the talk about no one in Gaza being innocent, or the emphasis is on damage, not precision, or we're going to flatten Gaza, or we're going to level it, or we're going to burn it, or we're going to nuke it. We will eliminate everything. We're going to thin out the population, and so on and so forth. There's a very, very strong case to be made that this is a genocide happening right now. Now, if it is a genocide, of course, we have to ask ourselves, was Tufan al-Aqsa a really terrible mistake? You know, there's this idea that Hamas and the other resistance factions shouldn't have done this because they induced this genocide. This is a problem. I think, first of all, we need to realize that we do not yet know the final outcome of this battle. We do not know the strength of the resistance in Gaza and its allies in the region. It's too early for a balance sheet of what happened during Tufan al-Aqsa. It's the battle on the ground that is determining the outcome. Second, the wager of the resistance on the 7th of October was that we're going to shake things up so dramatically that we're going to force, or perhaps better, inspire our allies in the resistance factions in the region to join this battle and fundamentally shift the balance of forces. And the major hope here, of course, was that Hezbollah would intervene. Now, there was a contradiction in this wager because Tufan al-Aqsa wasn't and couldn't have been coordinated with these allies. You know, it had to be kept extremely secret. And one of the most impressive feats of that day, of course, was that the Palestinians could pull this off despite the Israeli surveillance apparatus being the most advanced and sophisticated in all of the world. And this is something that we might learn on other battlefronts. You know, there's often this argument that the technological power of our enemy is such that resistance is no longer possible. Well, regardless of everything else that happened on that day, if there's something that was proven conclusively on the 7th of October, is that if you're creative enough, you can outwit even the most technologically advanced, superior enemy. But that required secrecy. So it was impossible for the Palestinian resistance to, in advance, coordinate this action with Hezbollah or even with the resistance groups in the West Bank, not to mention Yemen and Iraq and elsewhere. So Hezbollah was caught as surprised as everyone else. And Hezbollah hesitated. I mean, they already on the 8th of October, they intervened a little bit symbolically, but they didn't throw their weight into the battle as the resistance had hoped would be the case. Now, there are several reasons for that, but clearly this was the wager. And we don't know yet what the final balance sheet will be, but this was the wager of 7th of October. And again, I don't think we can blame the Palestinian resistance because it couldn't really have done otherwise. If it wanted to fundamentally destabilize the status quo, it had to do something extremely disruptive and radical, but it couldn't coordinate this with its allies because then the Israeli enemy would have known. Third, we should, I think, be careful about blaming the repression on its victims. Let's just take the case of a very famous massacre that happened in Europe, the Paris Commune. So the communards took over Paris, and it all ended with a massacre with somewhere between 20 and 30,000 people murdered on the streets of Paris, roughly the same casualty toll that we're at now. Now, would we then conclude that it was a mistake to have the Paris Commune because the massacre wouldn't have happened by the Paris Commune? Or would we say the massacre that happened was all on the account of the Versailles regime? It was not the fault of the communards themselves. Or the pogroms against Jews by the white counter-revolutionaries during the Russian Revolution. Would we blame the Bolsheviks for that? Or would we say, no, it's actually the fault of the fascist counter-revolutionaries to kill Jews in this manner? And you could take any other case. The argument then that if the Palestinians had done this on the 7th of October, there would have been no genocide. Well, I think perhaps the mistake of the resistance, if it ends up being defeated, was that it imagined that the Western world would restrain the occupation from committing outright and complete genocide. So perhaps the resistance underestimated the genocidal impulses or the appetite for genocide in contemporary imperialist powers in Europe and the US. I don't know if this is a moral stain on the resistance. I would doubt that we would make that conclusion. Fourth and finally, the alternative to what happened on the 7th of October would have been continuous, slow death for the Palestinians. And the rationale of Tufan al-Aqsa was to stop this slow death and bring the Palestine issue to the fore of world politics again. The point here being the very central point of Palestinian resistance, which is that Palestinians refuse to die in silence without fighting back. Now, this is where I wanted to sort of turn back to the question of climate, but I'm getting a little bit tired. I'm sure you're getting tired too. So I'm not going to riff on this for very long, except for saying that on the climate front, where we fight, this sounds crude, but in a certain scalar sense, the big disaster, we need a diversity of tactics, just like the Palestinian resistance. But I don't think that the tactics of the armed resistance will be relevant for the climate struggle, because fossil capital does not appear in the form of tanks, nor is it a settler colonial project. So however high we might, some of us, me included, might hold someone like Mohammed Deif in regard, we can't really recommend that the climate movement should copy him, because it faces an enemy of a completely different political character. What we can learn from and take back to the climate front is the spirit and the ethos of the Palestinian resistance, which is that even when the catastrophe is consummated, we keep resisting. Even when it's too late, when everything has been lost, when the land has been destroyed, we rise out of the rubble and fight back. We do not yield, we do not surrender, we do not give up. Palestinians do not die. Palestinians will never be defeated. And this, of course, is what the Palestinian resistance says again and again. Hamas, PFLP, all the factions. A strong army loses if it doesn't win, but a weak resistance army wins if it doesn't lose. And I, for one, hope that the ongoing war in Gaza will end with the resistance intact, and that would be a victory. The continuation of the Palestinian resistance in itself would be a victory, because precisely what it says is that we're going to continue fighting no matter the catastrophes that you pour on us. And this is a source of inspiration on the climate front and in any other front as well. And in this respect, I think that the Palestinians do not only fight for themselves, they fight for humanity as a whole, for the idea of a humanity that resists catastrophe in whatever shape or form, and that keeps going despite overwhelmingly superior force on the other side. And therefore, I think that there are all sorts of reasons for us to stand in solidarity with the Palestinian resistance for their own sake, but also for our own. And we can talk more about these climate resistance, Palestinian resistance articulations later, but I'll stop there. And sorry for taking so much time.